Okay, let's talk exam 3. A couple of the introductory points. The exam is not cumulative. It purely covers the material in the course since exam 2. I know you're all disappointed about that, but try to get over your disappointment. It is 24 multiple choice questions, an Excel solver problem, 4 short answer questions, and 2 vocabulary words. Both of the vocabulary words come off of the final vocabulary list. So that's all you're going to need to study for the last exam to refresh yourself. I think you're going to find if you can answer the questions that I say you need to be able to answer based on this review video, you're going to do extremely well in the exam. And I'm going to walk us through chronologically what we've covered in the third block. The first thing we started with was the idea of what does it cost to drill and complete a well. So now, by no means do you have to have memorized the items on the AFE, but you need to understand the items on the AFE because here's specifically what I'm going to be able to, or what I'm going to ask you to do. I want you to know the difference in expenses between drilling the well and then completing the well. In other words, what sorts of costs do you not incur if you do not complete the well versus what sorts of costs you always incur because they're required to drill the well. This is not something I'm going to ask you to pick a list off of this, but you just need to have in your own mind, okay, what's involved with completing the well, i.e. setting casing all the way through and then fracking the well and then putting on the equipment on the surface versus what do you have to do to find out if it's actually, there's minerals there. How about the cost difference between a vertical well and a horizontal well? Which costs less and why, which costs more and why. And again, I think all of those concepts should be quite evident if you just think through them based on everything we've had in the class. And then in those cases of horizontal versus vertical, completed versus dry hole not completed, you should have a feeling for, on some of the multiple choice questions, it's going to ask you which of the following is likely to be the greatest expense for a well of this. Don't worry about differentiating between, well, this is a little bit more expensive than this, or this could be a little more expensive than this. I'm looking for you to go and look at the AFEs that I provided you and just have in your mind what tend to be the most expensive items to drill the well, complete the well, horizontal versus vertical. And that will get you a couple of questions on the multiple choice. The next topic was about financing the wells or raising the money that you need to launch a drilling program. In this presentation, I talked about up front the difference between debt and equity and how they differed. And then if you go through the presentation, we talked about that quite a bit. And so you're going to need to be very clear on the differences between debt and equity and basically what are the pros and the cons of each. One specific type of debt that there's a question about is reserve-based lending. So make sure that you're familiar with reserve-based lending. And those are the questions out of the financing and the AFE material. I'm going to pause, change the presentation, and pick it up from there. The next major topic we're going to cover is the midstream industry. I introduced this lecture by talking about how midstream affects E&P. There's not really a single question that I could say you need to know the material that we discussed here, but I think you're going to find if you understand it, it's likely to just be good for you as you take the rest of the exam. Know that a lot of product is moved by pipeline, and when it comes to gas, virtually 100% is moved by pipeline. Also know why there was a spike in rail in these years. Make sure you're key on that, but also the disadvantages of rail. Going forward, I should have asked a question about batching here, but I didn't. So please do remember batching, but I screwed up and didn't put a question on the exam for that, and I'm not going to go back and change it now that I've got it finished. Again, not a specific question about this, but probably something that may help you in general with the exam if you're familiar with it. There is a specific question about the variability in demand for natural gas and the challenges that causes, and specifically that means that you have to find storage, places to storage. Also, so all these storage locations, also make sure you understand what line pack and peak shaving are. Also, from our terminology, you've got base gas versus working gas on your vocabulary. Nothing, oh, I'm sorry, let me go back one. Uh, Master limited partnerships is definitely a test question, so you should be familiar with the pros and the cons of MLPs. Nothing in particular on the companies. Then on the LNG market, you should understand when does it make sense to export LNG, and then who are the largest markets in LNG. One of the things I want to draw your attention to is even though we've talked a lot about China, the most current year that I have data for, 2014, China was still a smaller market than was South Korea and Japan. In the LNG process, this is a very dynamic area. Incidentally, I just saw where a company canceled one of their liquefaction train construction projects, and that'll get into why in another matter. But keep in mind of these four steps, if you will, in the LNG process, it's the liquefaction that is so expensive. And this was a picture of the Cheniere Energy train, is what they're called, that are required to liquefy the natural gas. These are very expensive plants. So that's where the dollars are, so to speak. And typically, what has happened, because the liquefaction is so expensive, the companies want to sign long-term contracts. In other words, you don't want to build this asset and then have the market be variable. You'd like to lock up, just like pipeline companies like to lock up a certain amount of capacity where they've got it on long-term contracts. So do LNG companies. Now, that's what I expect you to know, is that LNG companies typically like long-term contracts. The market, very challengingly for LNG companies, is moving away from that somewhat, which is why you saw the cancellation of that one I just referenced, because they weren't able to get enough long-term contracts. But this is where the bucks are, and because the bucks are so high, they like to lock up long-term contracts. That's it for the midstream. On to the downstream industry. Again, there are no specific questions about this, but I think understanding these concepts will probably help you understand or get some questions right down the line. In terms of the refining industry, I do expect you to have a feeling for where the bulk of the refining capacity is located. Nothing on these slides in terms of memorizing anything about that. I do want you to understand from a basic principles perspectives that the higher up you are on this list, typically what they call their higher value added fuels. So the naphtha and the LPG, but gasoline is the most common high value. Then you have what's called the distillates, or usually called the middle distillates, which are jet fuel and kerosene, and these are the heavy residues. Then, based on that information, I also want you to know that when it comes to that sort of stuff, crudes are not created equal. So I would definitely pay attention to, of the higher value products, gasoline and the distillates, which crude tends to produce more of each. That will be a test question. Also, I want you to have an understanding of the physics of the distilling process. Specifically in the distillation tower, I want you to know which end of this tower is hotter than the other, and how that matters as to where the products come out. In other words, what does temperature have to do with this process, and where the various products fall out in line. Cracking, the main thing I want you to know about cracking is basically what the statement says here, that it's usually heat involved, and that it's used to break the hydrocarbon chains into shorter hydrocarbons, typically to produce gasoline and also the middle distillates, but obviously gasoline is the higher value added product, so that would be the focus there. Nothing on that slide. I want you to know that refineries are very busy places with high utilization, and that's it for downstream. The key test question looks exactly like this. Know where states have primary military regulatory oversight and where the federal government has primary. And these are some of the examples we walked through to illustrate those. So that's an important question to know. Don't need to know about the specifics of the state. Don't need to know issues of the issues in Texas. And the one area where I specifically dove into was the water environmental issues. And remember what we talked about for the 2017 EPA study on fracking. And just to recap, that was a very controversial topic. When it was put out in draft, A lot of environmentalists were very upset that the EPA basically did not condemn fracking in their findings. And so it all became a tussle. The wording got changed some in the final draft, but the reality was the EPA found isolated incidents where fracking had affected very specific groundwater sites, but there was no systematic threat or no systematic contamination that was found, no broad scale contamination was found. And that was exactly what the survey said, much to the environmentalist concern. And so they did change the words a little bit to say that there could be a systematic threat, but it hadn't been found. So I want you to be aware of that. I talked about that in more detail in the original video, so make sure that you're well acquainted with what the EPA study on fracking said. And I believe that's it. We talked about a lot in the renewables chapters, or in the renewable lecture, and I'm sorry that I didn't have reading material for you. It's just not the sort of thing I've been able to find a textbook chapter or an academic journal summary article that provides it very well. But I think, again, if you go through the slides, you need to be familiar with some things that are just going to help you keep things straight in general, but I'm going to tell you some things that you should be very straight on. One is the issue of power density, and remember and how we illustrated that in our discussion of the Tesla versus the Camry. I want you to be familiar with baseload, intermediate, and peaking, and I also want you to know what types of generation sources tend to be usable for those concepts. I would like you to know the differences of concentrated solar power, CSP, versus photovoltaic. And you need to be very up on this concept of net metering. Make sure that you've watched these videos and you understand what the issue is from both perspectives. Going through. Okay. So here we talked about Texas as the big dog, both currently and in the immediate future. You need to be very familiar with why that is the case for the exam. I would definitely be familiar with this slide, particularly the rule of thumb, ROT equals a rule of thumb of what it costs to construct. I would also be very familiar with these issues and this rule of thumb about how much power it really generates. I want you to be familiar with this slide, but I'd be hard-pressed to remember that there's an exact exam question out of it. However, I remember very clearly there is an exact exam question, and specifically I want you to know approximately, based on this 2015 data from the Government Accounting Office, how much in tax preferences renewable energies as a category got and how much fossil fuels as a category got. So you need to do the math and add that up. Nothing about the power production agreements, nothing about Germany. So again, a lot in the renewables section, things that you're going to want to be familiar with. I've tried to point out the exact areas that you're going to want to be familiar, but I think just in general being familiar with the exam, with the whole material is going to help you answer the exam questions. Again, I have been very pointed. Every single test question that is on the exam, I guarantee you I've pointed to that slide or I've been very explicit about you need to make sure you're up on that. So I think if you are familiar with everything I've talked about in this video, you're going to do extremely well on the exam. Good luck.